What's going on? YouTube. Listen up, young elder gang. This is Shoeshine Joe at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video. Fam, I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes in this video. You will find history definitions, scripture information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning. The truth, keep in mind this. Content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button. Young elder gang, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, hit that bell, and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. John Horse, also called Juan Caballo and Juan Cavallo as a child by the Spanish Moors, was born around 1812 in Florida. Keep in mind, the Moors from Spain had enslaved the natives in Florida. John Horse wasn't a black man. Nobody is black for that matter. The white European nicknamed him Gopher John because he delivered. The white European named John, which also in slang terms means trick or toilet. He became Chief Gracious Horse. The colonizing historians lie and keep promoting this slave narrative. John Horse was a man of mixed Moorish and Creek ancestry from the Red Stick side. He was born into the Seminole Tribe. They lie to keep this slave from Africa narrative going. Remember the Creek split after the Creek Civil Wars, and the Creek that went to Florida formed the Seminoles. Chief Gracious Horse became a war chief in the Seminole Tribe in the Second Seminole War in Florida. He lived initially in the region that came to be called Micanopy, after the last head chief of the Florida Seminole in north-central Florida. John assumed the surname of his father, the Seminole trader Charley Cavallo. His father was Apalachee and Spanish Moors descent, and his mother was Creek. Charley Cavallo leaned more to his Spanish Moorish side, his surname Horse being believed to have been a translation of Cavallo, or Caballo, the Spanish word for horse. The young John also had a sister, Wannah, sometimes spelled Wannah or Warner in some sources. The War of 1812, the Creek War, and the Patriot War in Florida were a series of related conflicts around the time when John Horse was born. Being that Chief Gracious Horse had both sides, one from the Moors from Spain, his grandfather's side, and the native Creek, his mother's side, he was in a position to make things happen. He leaned more to his mother's side, the Creek. They lie and say his mother was a slave to the Spanish. This is so far from the truth. They were prisoners of war by way of the Spanish Moors colonizing their land. At that time, he and Juana were living with their mother in one of the Seminole settlements affiliated with, and under the jurisdiction of, the Alakua band of Oconee Seminole along the Suwannee River. In 1818, when the American General Andrew Jackson invaded the area, he scattered the tribal peoples in the region, destroying settlements and seizing people from among the Seminole for removal to the north to be enslaved on plantations. General Andrew Jackson felt natives were supposed to be slaves. John was displaced with his family by these actions since he first enters the historical record some years later as a young adolescent in the Tampa area. John Horse spent his formative years among his mother's people, the Oconee Seminole, living like other Indian little boys, learning to hunt and fish and developing tracking skills. He also became proficient with bow and arrow and with a rifle, developing a reputation in later life as a keen marksman with a steady hand in combat. Unlike many of his fellows, however, he also learned to read and write and acquired linguistic skills in English, Spanish due to his father's connection with the Spanish Moors. Other native people were forbidden to read and write. He also spoke the Hitchiti tongue spoken by the Oconee and many other Seminole bands. He was also conversant with Muskogee, the tongue of the Upper Creek Indians, see also Red Sticks, from whom the great Seminole war chief Osceola hailed. His mother was a Red Stick, Creek. Red Sticks refers to a traditionalist faction of the Muskogee Creek people. They were known for their resistance to Moorish and pale white European-American encroachment and assimilation, and their name derived from the red-painted war clubs they carried. The Red Sticks played a significant role in the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, which began as a civil war among the Creek Nation but escalated to involve the United States. In his adult years, he was one of Osceola's main translators when dealing with the Americans in Spanish, though Osceola himself understood some English. Fort Brooke at Tampa Bay. The First Seminole War, 1817-1818, occurred during Horse's childhood, and the youngster, along with his sister and mother, was probably among those displaced Seminole who fled south of the Suwannee River toward Tampa Bay. There, young John grew into adolescence and came into contact with American soldiers who had established an outpost, Fort Brooke, in the region with the formal annexation of Florida after the success of Jackson's incursions. John Horse first enters the written record in a short narrative by the officer in charge, Major George M. Brooke, who discovered the young Seminole boy had been swindling his personal cook by selling him the same land turtle, or tortoise, a so-called gopher, multiple times for the Major's personal mess. Discovering the young boy's fraud, Brooke opted for leniency and let John go on condition he make good on the missing turtles, which he apparently did. This began a lifelong relationship between John Horse and the American military, and vouchsafed him his nickname in later life, Gopher John. He would go on to fight against the American Army, on the side of his mother family, the Seminole, and, eventually, to work with the Americans. During the Second Seminole War of 1835 to 1842, which began when American colonizers pressured for Indian removal to free up their lands for white colonizers, John Horse served as what would be called today a field officer on the Indian side. At first a translator for the Indian leaders, since few of them spoke English while their Moorish allies did. He also became a lower-level war chief. Because of his facility with languages and quickness of mind, John Horse eventually found himself in the midst of the Seminoles' negotiations with the U.S. Corporation's army, as the war dragged on and open battles in the field gave way to guerrilla tactics and a long war of attrition. In the spring of 1838, after several pitched battles, Horse finally decided the fight against the Americans was unwinnable and surrendered to U.S. troops. This may have been prompted by the loss of his first wife, a full-blooded Seminole woman said to have been a daughter of Chief Holatuchi, a brother or nephew of the Chief Micanopy. John Horse was later offered money a second time by General William J. Worth for the services he subsequently rendered to the U.S. Army in the latter days of the Second Seminole War in Florida, as both translator and scout. But his initial decision to give up fighting had been in response to the offer of a prior general, Thomas Sidney Jessup, who had made the first promise of general deals and land to all Seminoles and their children willing to surrender, reclassify as blacks, Negroes, and colored, plus accept the contract of removal to Indian prison camp lands so that they could be rounded up by slavers. Thomas Sidney Jessup wanted the Seminole gone. He wanted them wiped out and to enslave what's left of them. He wanted to give the Seminoles a good swift kick in the butt for even thinking of standing up for their birthrights, lands, and for standing up against the colonizers, his masters. This would eventually be important as events unfolded a few years later in the West. Unfortunately, Horse's second wife and their children, who were removed to Indian prison camp with him, did not gain freedom through his later service and had only the earlier declaration by Jessup to fall back on, which was a trick and setup, thus remaining at risk from the increasingly aggressive activities of slave catchers in the new Indian Territory, catching Native Americans and sending them across the land. See, what they were doing is capturing the Native Americans and send them, let's say, from Florida to New York or from New York to Texas. This way, the native is not familiar with the area, so it made it harder to run away. They were captured from their tribal lands and sent across country. With other Seminole, Horse was shipped across the Gulf of Mexico from Tampa Bay to New Orleans and north from there by way of the Mississippi to Indian prison camp. There he and his family joined with the other Seminoles, who had accepted removal to take up residence at one of two locations assigned to the Seminole inside the Creek area. Horse quickly rose as a leader and chief among the removed Seminole because of his friendly relations with the Americans, his experience as a leader in the fighting, his linguistic skills, and decisive cleverness. In the new territory, John Horse worked sporadically for the Army as an interpreter and sometimes as an intermediary for the officers and the Indian leaders. Asked to help persuade the remaining Indian fighters in Florida to surrender and relocate to Indian prison camp as he and others had done, he returned to Florida in 1839 to act as go-between with one of the last Seminole war chiefs, Kikuchi, Chief Wildcat, eventually convincing his old friend to accept the inevitable and come in too. John Horse was sent back to Indian prison camp in 1842 as part of a group of about 120 other exiles, once the Army felt he had done what they needed. In Indian Territory again, the exiled Seminole leadership finally voted John Horse as a chief too, around the year 1843 in light of his services to the Seminole during their lengthy war. At the time, the main chief, Micanopy, Miko Nupa, had vouched for him. It was Micanopy, in concert with his council, who finally granted the warrior his chief status. Conflict arose in the territory because the transplanted Seminole had been placed on land allocated to the Creek Indians. The U.S. government knew this, and did this on purpose, hoping it would spark conflict, and they would kill each other off. The USA Corporation knew the tribal distinctions between the two peoples. The Seminole were a loose amalgam of Creek bands which had detached themselves from the Creek Indian Federation a century earlier and relocated to then Spanish Florida, although they had continued to maintain ethnic and some kinship ties with their northern Creek brethren in Georgia, Alabama, and part of the Carolinas. Because the Creek had become chattel slavery by force and were replaced with impostors, while the Seminole had not done the same and kept fighting, they lived in very different ways. USA hired slavers and those from other white militias groups soon began raiding the Seminole settlements to kidnap and enslave anyone they could get their hands on, and John Horse quickly became a focal point for organizing resistance to these encroachments, as well as led spokesman for his fellow Seminoles. In one case, when some slavers succeeded in capturing Dembo Factor, a veteran of the Seminole War, John Horse and his on-again, off-again ally, Coacucci, Chief Wildcat, who had hopes of succeeding Micanopy as leader of all the Seminole and who opposed living under the Creek, protested. The army, responding to their concerns, demanded and got Factor's release, but neither they nor the Creek Tribal Council pursued charges of kidnapping against the suspected white slavers. The slave raids continued as tensions mounted. They wanted all the Seminoles to be captured and sent to slave camps out west and up north, and to the islands far from their land, so they wouldn't find their way. In 1844, John Horse traveled to Washington, D.C., with a delegation of Seminole, including Coacucci, to argue for a separate land grant for the Seminole, on the grounds that they were and had been a separate people for at least 100 years. Failing to secure the backing they needed, they returned to Indian slave camps. But Horse traveled once more to Washington, this time on his own, acting as servant to an officer's brother, to lobby General Jessup to live up to his earlier broken promises. Jessup supposedly had a change of heart. Jessup liked he was sympathetic and felt a little guilty for having been instrumental in the treachery that took Osceola off the field and led to that chief's death. However, he could not overcome political resistance in Washington of his masters, where pressure was growing to reverse his grant of freedom to the enslaved Native Americans, who came in voluntarily. Perhaps in response to John's advocacy, Jessup traveled to Indian slave camps himself. He was now Quartermaster General for the entire U.S. Army, to arrange for the construction of new facilities at Fort Gibson, the Army's headquarters in the territory. While there, he compiled a list of all those who had surrendered under his order and validated it. These are the natives who chose to give up their birthrights and were reclassified as blacks, Negroes, and colored. They became nothing but slaves, and to add to the misdirection, they said they were slaves from Africa. General Jessup also offered them money for slave labor on the grounds of Fort Gibson on a construction project he had initiated. As a result, large numbers of Seminole left the two Seminole prison camps, Deep Fork and Little River, to resettle outside the fort's walls under Army protection. Once the work was done, however, these Seminole chose to remain because of the ongoing predations of Sellout Creek, Cherokee, and so-called Moorish and white slave catchers, creating yet another flashpoint of contention with the Army and the slaver gangs, who got paid $150 for every Seminole or any other outlaw tribe members they captured, and sent far north or far west to be enslaved. John Horse himself was attacked by unknown assailants at one point, thought to have been members of the $5 Creek Seminole faction, and came close to death from the bullet he took, but the would-be assassins were never located. After the incident, the officer in charge at Fort Gibson invited John and his family to take up residence inside the fort, which he did, giving up the claim he had staked out in the Indian area. The tensions extended to the Seminole Indian sub-agent, Marcellus Duval, an Alabamian $5 New Creek with land holdings back east and connections in Washington. His brother, William Duval, was also a connected attorney at nearby Fort Smith in Arkansas. The Seminole subagent who had infiltrated hoped to profit with the restoration of the Seminole into slave status and angled incessantly to bring it about. John also began objecting to what he deemed the Army's unauthorized protection of the Seminole, including allowing them to remain in their makeshift witness protection under Fort Gibson's walls. Sometime after John Horse's return from his second mission to Washington and Jessup's own visit and subsequent return east, John Y. Mason, U.S. Attorney General at the time, was designated by President James K. Polk to rule on the legitimacy of Jessup's emancipation of the former Seminole who were prisoners of war and nothing but slaves now. The demand for such a ruling was being pushed by Duval and his allies, and urged by his brother, the attorney William Duval, who had been retained by the Seminole Tribal Council, at the sub-agent's urging, to reclaim their rights to their former prisoners. John Mason, a Southerner, ruled that, since most of the Seminoles were descendants of prisoners of war, and thus legally still considered born into enslavement, Jessup's decree had illegally deprived their Seminole slaves. They say the Seminole Native Americans were the slaves and their legal property and could not be endorsed by the government. Man, who are these guys? Thus, the very reason many of the Seminoles had agreed to come in peacefully, and which had so seriously undermined the Seminoles' fight to remain in Florida, was suddenly and retroactively revoked. Things changed in the course of the Second Seminole War, when the old tribal system broke down under the pressure of the fighting, and the Seminole resolved themselves into loose war bands, living off the land with no distinction between tribal members. But this changed yet again in the new territory when the Seminole were obliged to settle on fixed lots of land and take up settled agriculture as European Moors. Other displaced tribes in the region took on more attraction for many of the Seminole. Their increasing poverty due to the poor land they had been given on purpose by the USA Corporation, hoping they would just go ahead, starve out, and die already. The Seminole sub-agent, Marcellus Duval the impostor, who was a Moor, and Half Creek became a tireless advocate for restoration of alleged Seminole property rights over their former allies in the field, a restoration he apparently hoped to turn to his own benefit, and then sell the land off to his father's side, the European Moors. With Mason's reversal of Jessup's wartime decree, those Seminoles who had been freed from prisoners of war by Jessup now suddenly found their status reversed, as Duval and the Moorish Creek infiltrators demanded the Seminole before into chattel slaves. A new open season by the raiders from nearby white groups and towns was about to commence as more than 280 Seminoles, including John Horse's own family, were now at risk again to be captured by agents and sent far north or far west in prison slave camps. Although the Army generals were friendly to John Horse and his interests, they were bound by their duty. The War Department, from whom the Army took its direction, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs were now arrayed against the interests of the Seminole. They wanted all Seminole gone and wiped out, and the ones they couldn't wipe out enslaved them and reclassified as blacks, Negroes, and colored. Then import foreigners to take their place. It's the oldest colonizing trick in the book. John Horse soon found himself allied with Coacoochee again as the two fought a rearguard action to halt the rise of the $5 Replacement Creek leadership among the Seminole and the loss of freedom for the Seminole. The two men wrangled with the various generals who quickly succeeded one another while the generals themselves played a delaying game with their Washington superiors. Eventually, however, Micanopy's death ended the stalemate, and the Army could no longer delay evicting the ad hoc Seminole settlement around the fort and sending its people back to certain Indian prison camps. Chief John Horse took charge of the exodus from Fort Gibson, but instead of taking his people to the site, Duval, the Indian imposter agent, had selected for them, close by his agency, Horse and another ally, the Seminole scout Tony Barnett, settled them at a place on the Little River. Chief John Horse named Wewoka, farther from the New Creek and the Seminole agency than Duval had counted on. Settling in, they set up defenses against the gangs of slavers, who quickly flocked around the new Seminole settlement. They were getting paid $150 for each Seminole and any other Native Americans they could catch. John Horse and Barnett settled on a plan which involved getting Marcellus Duval out of the way because they knew he was an agent working for the USA Corporation. John sent him to head off to Florida on a temporary mission which he thought would redound to his interest. To facilitate his agreement to make the trip, Barnett was a warrior and scout from the Chatta Nation, and came to help by becoming affiliated with the Seminole and the war against the colonizers, offered to serve as scout and translator. Barnett had reasons of his own for remaining behind since he was working to free his son, who had been enslaved by two fake $5 Cherokee imposters on the new Cherokee land set up by the government within New Indian Territory. New Indian Territory was a trap. It was to be able to get all the outlaw tribes in one area to wipe them out. Also, slave catchers surrounded the New Indian Territory to kidnap Native Americans day and night to sell them and sent them far north or far west to Indian prison camps, which later became known as plantations. While little Duval, the Moor, was gone with Barnett, John Horse speedily concluded a pact with his old friend Cocucci, disaffected because of his failure to be selected to replace Micanopy, and the two of them led an exodus from Wewoka and Indian Territory in general in the dead of night. They led over 100 Seminoles, including men, women, and children, and at least as many fleeing Seminole, out of the lands they had been placed on by the government to wipe them out, heading south across the Red River into Texas. There they began a dash across that vast state which would take them nearly a year, eventually incurring pursuit by Duval's slavers to catch all Seminoles to take the fight out of them, to kill off the last hope of the fighting spirit. The Texas Rangers, who had been authorized by the Texas governor to capture and return them to their Seminole prison camps set up by the government, and to Duval, who had placed a bounty on each Seminole man, woman, and child. From October 1849 until the summer of 1850, Horse and Coacucci led the migration south, picking up a troop of disgruntled Kickapoo Indians along the way, and facing the war arrows of the Comanche, who considered Cocucci's presence in their territory an affront. The government knew this as well, and were hoping they fight and get rid of each other, making it easy for them to finish them all off. The Comanche may have known of an agreement Cocucci had concluded with representatives of the Mexican government to gain land on which to live once in Mexico in exchange for his service on the border repelling Texan and Comanche raiders. The Seminole and the Comanche were the two biggest war tribes on the land. After a pitched battle with the Comanche, the fleeing party had to cross a desert region, meeting up with an old adversary, Major John T. Sprague, at the springs of Las Moras, just north of the Mexican border. That encounter is described in Sprague's own journals, which he compiled to document an expedition of supply wagons he led across southern Texas to resupply the outpost at today's El Paso, then the town of Franklin. Sprague had been a young captain back in Florida and had known both John Horse and Chief Wildcat there, having been involved in the latter's initial and then his final surrender. The three men sat into the night reminiscing and drinking from a bottle of liquor Sprague had supplied. But sometime in the early morning hours, the Indians learned that someone from the army camp had secretly gone to a nearby town to alert the Texas Rangers of their presence. Whether Sprague himself was implicated remains unknown. In the pre-dawn hours, John Horse and Cocucci woke their people and secretly departed the camp at Las Moras to make a last desperate dash to the Rio Grande. There they built makeshift rafts to ferry their people across. They were still hard at it, only midway across the river, when the Rangers and their allies abruptly arrived. But it was too late, and the Seminole and their other native tribe allies, the Kickapoo who had joined them, got across and made contact with officials in the Mexican state of Coahuila. There, in return for a pledge to fight all invaders and raiding parties from Texas, they were given land for their people and captaincies in the Mexican army on or about July 12, 1850. John Horse liked to drink, and at one point, after crossing back into Texas, he allowed himself to get too drunk and was taken captive by some local whites who may have known him or had a grudge against him. They offered to ransom him back to his people, and Cocucci collected the gold they demanded and sent it to them for John's life. When they opened the bag, they found the gold soaked with blood. It was Cocucci's message to them, and they fled. For several years, John Horse and Coacucci rode side by side in fulfillment of their contract with the Mexican government, but Coacucci soon died from smallpox, and most of the Seminole and Kickapoo who had followed him drifted away. John Horse remained with his people and became the settlement's de facto chief. After the American Civil War and United States passed their so-called Emancipation of Enslaved Natives, the U.S. Army recruited many of the Seminoles from Mexico to serve in the border states as scouts. John Horse was getting too old for that kind of active service, although he remained titular chief of his people, still captaining their fights against the various raiding parties which descended on Mexico from the north. In one famous incident, he returned with his men to find that a large Indian raiding party had attacked his settlement and captured many of his people in retaliation for his actions against them, in his capacity of providing border security. Leading all the able-bodied men he could find, about 40, including teenage boys, he took off after the Moors dressed like Indians. The raiders tried to draw the Seminole into a canyon, but John Horse, sensing the trick, ordered a halt and dismounted his men. He had been a wily commander back in Florida and still possessed a well-developed perceptive faculty for this sort of thing. When the Moors, dressed like Indians lying in wait within the canyon, saw that the Seminoles were not deceived by their ruse, they made a head-on frontal assault against the Seminole force. John Horse's men had only single-load rifles, mostly of vintage type, and when they had discharged their first volley, it failed to turn the Moors dressed like Indians who just kept coming at them. As the men scrambled to reload their weapons, John Horse stepped out in front of his men and leveled his own empty weapon at the oncoming leader, taking deliberate and careful aim. He had always been a crack shot, and they knew it. When the leader saw John's rifle directed straight at him, he lost his nerve and swerved his horse, all those behind following him, thus breaking the charge and giving John Horse's men and boys time to complete their reload. In the end, the Moors dressed like Indians fled, and John Horse's Seminole retrieved their people. As John Horse aged, though, many of his people migrated back across the Texas border to work for the U.S. Army as scouts. These men and their families settled near Fort Clark in what is now Bracketville. In his 70s, John Horse faced another crisis when local landowners tried to take the land the Mexican government had originally given to the Seminoles. John Horse rode out once more to Mexico City to obtain reaffirmation from the government of their land grant and to put a stop to the local land grab from the colonizers. He was never heard from again, and it is commonly thought that he died on this trip to the capital in 1882. Several hundred descendants of Seminoles, known as Mascogos, still reside in Coahuila today.